the story of when I was born. Many of us have either made this request or been on the receiving end of this request. I still enjoy asking my own parents. I love hearing the details of the day I was born. I was my parents' first child. My mom was induced. My dad had refused to attend any of the birth prep classes. He was certainly not going to watch any of the videos. So my mom labored and got to the point where she was ready to push. My dad stayed right by her head. My mom had told the nurses and the doctor that she wanted the mirror that would allow her to see the moment that she birthed her child into the world. My dad was not expecting the mirror. And side note here, it seems important context. In college, my dad changed his major from pre-med to chemistry after frog dissection day in the biology lab. It was neither a good day for the frog nor my dad. I think both of their insides wound up outside. So the mirror was not a good thing. As the story goes, the doctor, sitting at the end of the bed, saw me about to be born and the color simultaneously draining from my dad's face. So in one moment, the doctor kicked the mirror out of the way. Two nurses moved around the bed to catch my father as he fell to the floor. And with one last push from my mother, I was born. The pictures from later that day show my mom sitting in the rocking chair in the room, holding me, visiting with my grandparents, talking on the phone, sharing the news. The pictures show my dad, still colorless, and he being the one lying in the hospital bed, trying to recover from the day's labor. So this is the story of my birth. I've heard it so many times from my mom, my dad, my grandparents. They all have their favorite parts and the things that they focus on and want to be sure to point out. And so these are more than just a list of facts or details. The story shares something of relationships and identity. The story communicates the beginning. And the beginning is always in conversation with the present and the future. So from Exodus today, we hear this. The Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the Egyptians. This story from Exodus today is a birth story. It's a beginning story. And if we missed it, we might remember the beginning of Genesis where the Holy Spirit moves over the chaotic waters. Here it's happening again. This is a beginning. It's a birth. It's a story about relationships and identity, about who we are as God's people, and most importantly, about who God is. It's a story about our beginnings, and so it's also a story about our present and our future. The crossing of the Red Sea is a story we keep retelling. It's a familiar one. It is a defining story for God's saving character. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the Egyptians. After this day and this event, God will continue to remind the people of this saving act. I am the Lord your God, God will say, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. This is our identity, our relationship. You are my people, and I am the one who saves. The words we heard today from Exodus include most of the story of the crossing of the Red Sea. All of the familiar parts are there. The Israelites walk through the sea on dry ground. The Egyptians are consumed by the sea, and if we missed the irony, here the Egyptians are in the sea suffering the same fate that Pharaoh tried to impose on all of the Hebrew male children. But we miss something in this birth story if we don't expand our vision just slightly. Backing up from where we begin today at verse 19 to verse 10 of chapter 14. When we do that, we meet the Israelites just as they spot Pharaoh and his army on the horizon. The people have just left Egypt. Freedom does not yet seem real, and here come the Egyptians. In verse 10 and following, we hear these words. In great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone, and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." The people are afraid, and they project their fears onto Moses. They quickly forget how they participated in the Passover. It was their choice. They actively sought God's deliverance, and at God's invitation, participated in God's plan for salvation. It's easier to blame. And so the people blame Moses. They act as if Moses compelled an entire people to get up and leave Egypt. It's also easier to forget what they already know of Yahweh. They have forgotten that Yahweh has heard their cries and that there has already been a series of saving acts that have brought them to this point. And so Moses hears all of these fears. He is present to them, and in verse 13, Moses responds, "Do not be afraid," he tells the people. "Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today." These commands, these invitations are a really important part of this birth story, of our birth story, of the story of how these beginnings now bear on our present and on our future. The Israelites have the Red Sea before them. They have the army of Pharaoh at their back. They are in desperation and can see no way forward to save themselves. They cry out in fear. And when they do, Moses reminds them to whom they belong. Their God is a saving God. Do not be afraid. These words are familiar ones in the relationship of God and God's people, to Abraham, to Moses, to Mary. In the moment and given the circumstances, it feels counterintuitive, but still the invitation and the call is do not be afraid. Stand firm, not in the sense of preparing for a fight. We may read that into this, given the heavy military language and imagery, but this is not about getting ready for a fight. This is about taking your place, preparing yourself to witness the extraordinary saving act of God. Stand firm. and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. Witness it. Our God is a saving God, Moses reminds the people, and your work today, he tells them, your act of faith and of trust is to hold your fear in the light of God's promise of salvation. Take your place and get ready, for you are about to witness God's act of salvation. God is going to do for you, going to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. Stand firm. Salvation is near. And then we pick up where we started in our reading today at verse 19, and we hear and see God doing God's saving work. The pillar of cloud, the image of God with the people, moves from in front of them to behind them. God literally comes between the Israelites and the Egyptians and makes a way forward. And the people take their place and walk on the dry ground and witness their salvation. This story of our beginning matters. Our God is a saving God. That is our beginning. And so in our present or in our future, when we come to the place where the great sea stretches out before us and where Pharaoh's army is at our back, this story needs to so live in us that we can hear the voice of Moses in the wilderness. Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you. Because we know our beginnings, we know that God will move in the pillar of cloud and fire between us and whatever it is at our back. Another literal Pharaoh with systems of oppression and strife, or any of the other armies, big and small, internal and external, that lurk over the horizon. God is working God's deliverance. Our work is to witness it, to expect it, to believe it. A note in closing. In this birth story, in this story of our beginning, we may understandably be uncomfortable with the image of drowning Egyptians fleeing before God, with the salvation of God being tied to military might and dead bodies on the seashore. It's okay to be uncomfortable. This is where it's important to remember our distance from the culture and society in which these stories were told. The inspiration of the Holy Spirit is absolutely here. And so are the realities of the storytellers. For the Hebrew storytellers, when one of your later enemies has an imposing chariot force and you have no chariot force to speak of, then it serves you well to communicate how fantastically your God destroys chariot forces. It's a real thing. That dynamic is real. It's moving here. There are other points that commentators refer to as, quote, gratifying historical fantasy. Upon hearing this story, we may believe that after this moment, Egypt ceased to exist. No more imperial power, no more Pharaoh. And it wasn't the case. Egypt continued to be an enemy of Israel. They continued to be in conflict with one another. So these details make the text uncomfortable, but they do not make the text any less sacred. And they do not change the saving character of our God. The saving character that extends to God incarnate in Jesus. As Jesus is in the garden with his disciples on the night of his arrest, many of the disciples are ready to take up the sword. One of them even does, striking one of those who have come to arrest Jesus. The disciples know the birth story. They know the story of Exodus and would not mind seeing Roman soldiers drowned and dead on the seashore. Jesus is present to their fear, and he speaks to them in their fear, and he speaks in the spirit of Moses. Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. Deliverance that looks like the cross. Salvation that looks like sacrificial love. Salvation that proclaims forgiveness even to us who would place Jesus on the cross. Jesus comes between us and the armies of Pharaoh at our back. The violence we would do to ourselves, to creation, and to one another. This is who God is, from the beginning and always. Our God is a saving God. Do not be afraid. Stand firm and witness the salvation that God will accomplish, that God is accomplishing.